Alien Commander laughed at human pain. The Deathworld girl made him beg for mercy, HFY Sci-Fi. Best Seth Walker had never imagined this would be how his mission would end. He had been trained for war, battle-tested in the harshest conditions Earth had to offer, but nothing could have prepared him for the alien ship. The cold, metallic walls of the Zithar cruiser pressed down on him as he sat shackled to a rusty chair in the middle of the interrogation room. His arms and legs were bound tightly, the chains biting into his skin, but it wasn't the physical pain that hurt most, it was the helplessness. The Zithar were known across the galaxy for their cruelty, and Seth had heard stories of their brutal methods. But to experience it firsthand was something else entirely. He had been captured during a failed mission on a hostile planet, one that the Zithar had invaded and turned into a nightmare of scorched earth and shattered skies. He'd fought hard to escape, but the odds had been stacked against him from the start, and now he was their prisoner. The air in the room was cold, making his skin crawl. But it wasn't the temperature that made Seth shiver. It was the sound of footsteps approaching from the other side of the door, the unmistakable sound of an alien who was about to make him suffer. The door slid open, and Seth was greeted by the tall, imposing figure of Commander Calthar. He was a Zithar, a creature who towered over most humanoids, with dark, glistening skin that shimmered in the low light. His eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, and a cruel smile curled at the corners of his lips. Well, 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 Calthar's voice was like a low growl, almost too soft to hear but filled with malice. A human, how pathetic. Seth didn't respond. He had learned long ago that talking back to his enemies never worked in his favor. Besides, he wasn't interested in making this any easier for the Zithar. Calthar circled him slowly, studying him like a predator sizing up its prey. You humans think you're so strong, so resilient, but I'll make you break, I'll make you beg. Seth's jaw clenched. He had been through worse. The thought of giving Calthar the satisfaction of seeing him hurt, of hearing him beg, was unbearable. He couldn't let that happen. Without another word, Calthar gestured to the two guards standing by the door. They stepped forward and pulled Seth from the chair, forcing him to stand. His legs wobbled slightly, weak from the restraints and the lack of movement, but he remained silent, his expression unreadable. Calthar raised a hand, and one of the guards approached with a device in hand. It looked like some kind of energy whip, its glowing blue tendrils crackling ominously. The Zithar commander stepped back, his eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. Let's see how much your human body can take, Calthar sneered. I'm curious to know if you'll break before you die. Seth steeled himself. He had faced pain before many times. This would be no different. But as the guard swung the energy whip, Seth could feel the sting of the first strike across his back. The pain was immediate and intense, like being burned by 1,000 needles all at once. He gritted his teeth and refused to scream. That was exactly what Calthar wanted, and Seth wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. The whip came again, and this time it struck across his chest. The burn of it made him flinch, but he didn't cry out. He refused. His breath was ragged, but he focused on keeping his mind clear, pushing aside the pain. He wasn't going to give up. Calthar watched, disappointed. I thought humans were supposed to be resilient, but this is just pathetic. You're weak. But Seth didn't flinch. He didn't give in. He had trained his whole life to withstand torture, to endure the impossible. If he could survive the battlefields of Earth, he could survive this. The whip struck again, and this time the pain was unbearable. His body screamed for relief, but he held on. Each strike made him feel like his skin was being burned away, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself to focus on something else. Anything else. Calthar laughed. You're stubborn, I'll give you that, but I'll break you eventually. All humans break. It's only a matter of time. But Seth didn't answer. He refused to give Calthar the satisfaction of seeing his pain. His mind drifted, trying to escape the searing pain. Thoughts of Earth, of his family, of the people he fought for. They gave him the strength to endure, even as his body cried out for release. Hours passed. Maybe it was days. He wasn't sure anymore. Time lost its meaning as the torture continued. The strikes of the whip came faster, each one tearing through his flesh like a knife. Blood poured from his wounds, but still, Seth refused to speak. Through it all, he could hear Calthar's mocking laughter. The commander seemed to enjoy every moment of it, like a cat playing with a mouse. "You're stronger than I expected," Calthar said, sounding almost impressed. "But don't think that means anything. I will break you, human, I will make you beg." But Seth's resolve never wavered. He wouldn't give in. Just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the door to the room slid open again. But this time, it wasn't a guard or another officer. This time, it was someone unexpected. A figure stepped into the room, a woman, small but with a presence that filled the space. She moved like she knew exactly what she was doing, like a predator who was used to hunting in the darkness. Seth didn't recognize her, but something about her gave him a strange sense of hope. He couldn't explain why, but as she approached, he felt a shift in the air. This woman wasn't just any prisoner. She was different. There was something in her eyes, a fierce, unyielding fire that told him she wasn't going to let this continue. Calthar turned toward her, his expression a mixture of confusion and anger. "Who are you?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she met Calthar's gaze with a calm, almost detached expression, and then without warning she spoke. "Release him." Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight to it. Seth could see the surprise flicker in Calthar's eyes, but the commander quickly masked it with arrogance. "This is no concern of yours, human," Calthar sneered. "You're too late. This one is mine." The woman didn't flinch. She simply nodded to Seth, as if acknowledging something unspoken between them. Then, with a movement faster than Seth's eyes could follow, she lunged toward the commander. For a moment, the room went silent. Seth, even in his pain, could only watch in awe as the woman moved with the precision of someone who had lived through hell itself. He couldn't help but wonder who she was and why she was here. But one thing was clear: she wasn't here to negotiate. She was here to fight. Seth could hardly believe what he was seeing. The woman who had just entered the room moved with a fluid grace that was almost otherworldly. She wasn't like the other humans he had known, nor like the alien soldiers who had tortured him. She was something else entirely. There was an intensity in her eyes, a quiet fury that sent a ripple of unease through the Zithar soldiers who stood by. Calthar, the alien commander, seemed taken aback by the sudden appearance of this stranger. His glowing eyes narrowed and his lips curled into a sneer as he faced her. "What do you think you're doing?" Calthar's voice was a deep growl. "You're in no position to make demands." The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she met his gaze with calm determination. "Release him." Now, the cold, cruel air in the room seemed to shift as her words hung in the air. Seth didn't know who she was, but something about her presence made him feel as if he might finally see the end of this nightmare. She wasn't scared, and that was enough to give him hope. Calthar let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "Release him," his voice echoed in the small room. "I think you're mistaken, human. This one is my prisoner. You have no authority here." Seth strained against his chains, trying to sit up in his seat. His body was still sore from the previous tortures, but he managed to focus on the woman. There was something familiar about her, something that made him feel like he should know her. She wasn't just some random prisoner who had ended up in this place. She had a purpose. But before Seth could say anything, the woman moved. It was almost too fast for him to follow. In an instant, she crossed the room, closing the distance between herself and Calthar. The alien commander took a step back, clearly startled by her speed, but he quickly recovered, his arrogance flooding back. "Do you think you can defeat me?" Calthar bellowed. "You are nothing to me. I am a commander of the Zithar. You are weak." The woman didn't respond with words. Instead, she acted. Her fist shot out like a lightning strike, connecting with Calthar's chest in a sickening thud. Seth could hear the crack of the Zithar commander's armor as it buckled under the blow, sending the alien stumbling back. Seth's heart skipped a beat. The alien was huge, nearly twice his size, but this woman had taken him down with a single punch. Calthar reeled from the impact, struggling to stay upright. He glared at the woman with a look of disbelief and fury, his hands reaching for the weapon at his side. "You dare strike me," Calthar spat, his voice low and threatening. "You'll pay for this." But the woman was already moving again. In one fluid motion, she twisted behind Calthar, using his own momentum against him. She grabbed his arm, yanked him backward, and slammed him into the ground with an explosive crash. The sound of the impact shook the room, and for a moment Seth thought the ship itself might have trembled in response. Calthar groaned, his body crumpling under the force of the woman's attack. He struggled to regain his footing, but the woman was relentless. She didn't give him a chance to recover. "You're weak," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "I'm not here to negotiate with you. I'm here to show you the power of a true warrior." Seth could hardly believe what he was witnessing. The Zithar, who were feared across the galaxy, were now struggling against this human woman. He'd seen many brave soldiers in his life, but none who could take on a creature like Calthar and make it look so easy. For a brief moment, Seth wondered who this woman was and how she had come to be here. Was she a soldier like him, or was she something else, something even more dangerous? But he didn't have time to think about it for long. As Calthar slowly regained his bearings, the woman stepped back and adopted a defensive stance. She wasn't just strong, she was skilled. Her movements were precise, calculated. She didn't waste energy. She was like a hunter, moving with purpose, ready to strike at the slightest mistake. Calthar sneered and stood, his posture becoming more aggressive. "You are a fool," he said, his voice laced with venom. "You will regret this. I'll make sure of it." The alien commander lunged forward, swinging a massive arm at her in an attempt to strike. But the woman was already anticipating the move. She ducked low, then spun around Calthar's side, landing a powerful knee to his back. The Zithar commander gasped in pain, his body unable to keep up with her speed. Seth watched in awe as the woman's every move seemed calculated to disable him, not kill him. She wasn't out for blood. She was out to humiliate Calthar, to show him that his size and strength meant nothing when it came to true combat. "You fight like a child," the woman said, her voice cold and without mercy. "Your arrogance will be your undoing." Calthar roared in frustration, his pride taking a serious hit. He launched himself at her again, but this time, the woman was ready. She sidestepped his attack and sent him crashing into the wall with a powerful punch to his midsection. The wall cracked under the force and Calthar slumped to the floor, winded and helpless. Seth couldn't believe what he was seeing. The mighty Calthar, who had tormented him for so long, was now on the ground, defeated by this human woman. His mind raced as he tried to understand how this could be happening. How had she done this? And who was she? The woman turned toward Seth, her eyes meeting his for the first time. There was no fear in her gaze, only determination. It was like she knew exactly what was at stake, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. "You," she said softly, "are not alone, not anymore." Seth opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. The woman's eyes flickered toward the door, then back to Calthar. The Zithar commander was groaning, struggling to rise, but he was clearly defeated. "I don't have much time," she said to Seth. "I came to get you out of here, but we need to move. Now." Seth nodded, his mind still spinning. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why had she come for him? But there was no time for questions. The door to the room began to open and the woman acted quickly. She grabbed Seth by the arm, yanking him to his feet with surprising strength. The Zithar soldiers outside would be on them in moments, but the woman was already moving, guiding Seth toward the exit with a sense of urgency. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, as if she had studied the ship's layout beforehand. "We're getting out of here," she said with quiet confidence. Seth, still dazed from the earlier torture and the shock of seeing Calthar defeated, could hardly believe it. But he didn't question her. She was his best chance at survival, and maybe, just maybe, she had come to save him. Seth's heart pounded as he followed the woman down the narrow corridor, his mind still struggling to catch up with the whirlwind of events. A few moments ago, he had been shackled, barely able to move, at the mercy of the cruel Zithar commander. Now, here he was, being pulled through the halls of the alien ship by a woman who had single-handedly defeated the commander in a way Seth had never imagined possible. He glanced over at her as they moved. She was focused, her eyes scanning the path ahead, and yet there was something about her that made Seth feel safer, despite the danger surrounding them. She was small compared to the Zithar soldiers they had encountered, but there was no mistaking the quiet power she exuded. She moved with a kind of efficiency, like someone who had done this before. He wanted to ask her who she was, what she was doing here, but there was no time for questions. The ship's dim lights flickered as they rounded a corner, and Seth felt the familiar rush of panic rise in his chest. He could hear the voices of the Zithar soldiers behind them, shouting in alarm, realizing that something had gone wrong. The woman didn't slow down. If anything, she moved faster. "We need to keep moving," she said in a low voice, almost to herself. "The more noise we make, the more likely they are to catch up." Seth nodded, his breath coming out in ragged gasps as he did his best to match her pace. His body still ached from the torture, but the adrenaline was beginning to drown out the pain. He could feel the weight of the chains still on his wrists, but he didn't dare to ask her to slow down long enough to free him. Right now, all that mattered was getting out. As they approached another corner, the woman signaled for him to stop. She moved silently, slipping into the shadows, her body blending into the darkness like a predator. Seth did his best to stay still, listening to the distant sound of boots thumping down the metal hallway. The Zithar were coming, and it wouldn't be long before they reached the point where Seth and the woman had entered. The footsteps grew louder, and Seth's pulse quickened. He could hear the Zithar voices now, shouting commands to each other. The woman was already ahead of him, crouching low, her eyes narrowed as she focused on their next move. Seth held his breath, praying they wouldn't be caught. "Stay quiet," she whispered over her shoulder. "We're almost there." Seth swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but he couldn't afford it. They were so close now, so close to freedom. All he had to do was hold on a little longer. The Zithar soldiers turned the corner, and Seth could see their shadows stretching along the wall. They were too close. The woman's eyes flicked to him for a brief moment, and then, without a word, she moved. She was like a blur, her movements smooth and silent. In an instant, she darted across the hallway, taking out the two soldiers who had been closest to them before they even had a chance to react. Seth didn't even see her strike. One moment they were there, and the next they were on the ground, unconscious. The woman didn't pause. She grabbed Seth's arm and yanked him forward, her grip surprisingly firm, her strength making him feel like he was floating through the hallways. Seth's mind was spinning. He had just watched her take down two fully armed Zithar soldiers in a blink of an eye. He couldn't fathom how someone so small could be so strong, but he didn't have the time to dwell on it. They continued moving, quickly but cautiously. Every step brought them closer to the ship's exit, but also closer to being discovered. Seth's heart raced as they approached another checkpoint. This one had two guards standing in front of a large door. They were clearly more alert than the others, their eyes scanning the corridor as they chatted. Seth stopped, just behind a corner, trying to catch his breath. The woman crouched next to him, her body tense and focused. "This is going to be tricky," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to take them down silently or we'll be swarmed in seconds." Seth nodded, his throat dry. He had no idea how they were going to get past these guards, but he trusted her. She had already done the impossible once. Maybe she could do it again. The woman moved before Seth could even think. She was quick, faster than anything Seth had ever seen. She sprinted toward the guards, but she didn't charge at them head-on. Instead, she slid behind one, her body barely making a sound. Seth saw her hands move in a blur, and in an instant the first guard was down. She hadn't killed him. She had knocked him out cold, her arm wrapped around his throat in a hold that was so precise it took less than a second to subdue him. The second guard had no time to react. Before he even turned around, the woman had already taken him out in the same silent fashion. One moment, both guards were standing, and the next, they were lying on the ground, unconscious. Seth blinked, barely able to comprehend what he had just seen. She had taken out both guards without making a sound. It was like she was a shadow slipping past them unnoticed. There was no way he could have done that. He was good, but not like this. The woman turned back to him, her face calm, but there was a glint in her eyes. This way. Seth didn't ask questions. He just followed her, keeping close as they moved toward the exit. Every turn, every corner brought them closer to freedom, but Seth knew it wouldn't be long before the rest of the Zithar were after them. They had to move quickly. They reached the final door, the one leading out of the ship. The woman stopped just short of it, her eyes narrowing as she checked the surroundings. Seth could hear the distant sounds of alarms starting to blare. The Zithar were getting wise to their escape. "We're almost there," the woman said, her voice steady. "But once we're through this door, we'll need to run." Seth nodded. He could feel his heart racing, the weight of the chains still on his wrists, but all of that seemed small compared to the thrill of getting away. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a spark of hope. He wasn't just going to survive, he was going to escape. The woman turned toward the door, her eyes locked on the control panel. She quickly accessed it, and within moments the door slid open, revealing the dark void of space beyond. The cool air of the outside world rushed in, but Seth barely felt it. His focus was entirely on the woman, the one who had brought him this far, who had made the impossible seem possible. "We need to go," she said, pulling him through the door. Seth stepped out into the open, the stars stretching out before him like an endless sea. The ship was enormous, and as he looked down at the surface, he realized that this was only the beginning. They weren't safe yet. But for the first time, Seth allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They were out. They had made it, but the Zithar wouldn't give up easily. Seth knew that. The hunt was just beginning. The cool, empty void of space stretched endlessly before Seth as he stumbled out of the ship's exit and onto the surface of the alien planet. The stars above twinkled, each one a distant reminder of the vastness of the galaxy, and the faint glow of the alien cruiser loomed behind them. But for the first time since his capture, Seth felt a small sense of freedom. The woman's hand was still gripping his arm, guiding him away from the ship, her movements swift and purposeful. "Keep moving," she urged, her voice quiet but firm. Seth nodded, feeling the weight of the chains around his wrists, though they were no longer his primary concern. His legs were sore from the torture, his body still aching from the abuse he had endured, but his mind was sharper now, focused on the task at hand: escape. He glanced back at the alien ship, watching the red glow of its engines flicker as alarms blared in the distance. They had been detected. He knew that the Zithar would be in pursuit, and the woman was right. They couldn't afford to stop. Not for anything. They moved quickly, sticking close to the shadows cast by the alien structures around them. The planet was desolate, with jagged rocks and barren ground stretching out in every direction. There were no signs of life, no shelter, just miles of rocky terrain that seemed to go on forever. It wasn't the kind of place one would choose to hide, but it was the only place they had at the moment. "Where are we going?" Seth asked, his voice hoarse from the lack of water and the physical toll he had suffered. The woman didn't answer immediately. She kept moving, scanning the area ahead, making sure no Zithar soldiers were waiting in ambush. Her pace was relentless, and Seth found himself struggling to keep up. Despite his exhaustion, he couldn't help but admire her determination, her focus. There was no hesitation in her steps, no doubt in her mind. She was a woman on a mission, and Seth was beginning to wonder just how deep that mission went. "I've got a safe house nearby," she finally said. "It's not far, but we need to get there before they find us." Seth nodded again, swallowing the burning lump in his throat. He wasn't sure if the woman could see the fear in his eyes, but he knew that it was there. The Zithar would come after them, and they wouldn't stop until they found them. Seth had been trained to fight, but even he knew that taking on the Zithar was a battle he couldn't win alone. The woman must have sensed his unease because she spoke again, her voice a little softer this time. "Don't worry. They won't catch us, not unless we make a mistake." Seth wasn't sure if that was supposed to reassure him or not, but it didn't matter. He had no choice but to trust her. She had already proven herself capable of far more than he had ever expected. He just had to hope that she could keep them both alive long enough to escape the Zithar and get back to the safety of Earth. As they continued moving, the sound of the Zithar alarms grew louder. Seth could hear the distant hum of their ships, likely already preparing for a full-scale search. The planet's surface offered little cover, and if they didn't find shelter soon, they would be caught. Seth's heart began to race as the reality of their situation sank in. The woman stopped abruptly, and Seth nearly bumped into her. She raised a hand, signaling for him to be quiet. "They're coming," she whispered. Seth barely had time to react before he heard the unmistakable sound of boots crunching against the rocky ground. A group of Zithar soldiers appeared from around a cluster of rocks, their glowing eyes scanning the area. They were methodical, moving in tight formation, searching for any sign of movement. Seth's breath caught in his chest, his muscles tensing as he tried to blend into the shadows. The woman's grip tightened on his arm, and for the first time, Seth felt a chill of fear run down his spine. He knew the Zithar were relentless. They would tear the planet apart if it meant finding them. "We need to stay still," the woman said, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't make a sound." Seth nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the heat of the Zithar soldiers, searchlights sweeping over the rocks, their beams flashing across the barren landscape. Seth held his breath, praying they wouldn't notice him and the woman hiding in the shadows. The soldiers passed by, their movements slow and deliberate. Seth's body trembled with tension, every muscle screaming for movement, but he forced himself to remain still. He could hear the Zithar soldiers talking among themselves, their voices low and guttural. They were close now, so close that Seth could hear their footsteps in the dust, feel the weight of their presence. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, the Zithar moved on. They were gone, their footsteps fading into the distance. Seth let out a quiet breath of relief, his body relaxing for the first time since they had started running. The woman's grip on his arm loosened and she gave him a brief nod. "Let's go," she said. They continued moving, though Seth's pace was slower now. He was beginning to feel the weight of the chains on his wrists again, the cold metal biting into his skin. But the woman never slowed, and he did his best to keep up, focusing on the horizon in front of them. After what felt like hours, the woman finally stopped and pointed toward a small, hidden structure in the distance. It was barely visible, tucked away behind a large outcropping of rocks. Seth could hardly make it out in the dim light, but he knew it was their destination. "We're here," she said. "We should be safe for now." Seth didn't hesitate. He moved forward, his body aching with every step, and the woman led him to the entrance of the hidden structure. It was small but sturdy, built to blend in with the natural landscape. The door was camouflaged, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The woman reached for a small device at her waist and pressed a button, causing the door to slide open with a soft hiss. Inside it was dark and cool, a welcome relief from the heat of the planet's surface. The woman stepped inside first, pulling Seth along with her. Once they were both inside, the door closed behind them with a soft click, sealing them off from the outside world. Seth took a moment to look around. The safe house was simple but well-equipped, with basic supplies scattered around the small room. There were weapons on the walls, along with food and water. A cot was pushed against one wall, and a small, makeshift desk sat in the corner. The place was clearly built for someone who expected to stay hidden for a long time. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, turning to face him. Her voice was soft but still held that steely edge. "You look like you've been through hell." Seth gave her a small, tired smile. "You have no idea." The woman stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "I know the Zithar did a number on you, but we're not out of the woods yet. They'll be looking for us, and it won't take them long to figure out we're gone." Seth nodded, feeling the weight of the truth in her words. They had escaped for now, but the hardest part was still ahead. "We'll have to move again soon," she continued. "But for now, we rest. You've earned it." Seth didn't argue. He sank down onto the cot, feeling the exhaustion hit him like a wave. The room seemed to spin for a moment, but he closed his eyes, allowing himself to finally relax. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't in pain. He wasn't running for his life. For the first time he felt safe. But he knew it wouldn't last. The Zithar would come, and when they did, Seth would be ready. The safe house was quiet, but Seth couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away. The woman, the Deathworld girl, as he had started calling her in his mind, was still moving around, checking the supplies, making sure everything was in order. Seth could see the same determination in her eyes that he had seen since the moment she first entered the Zithar ship, but now it was more than that. There was something deep in her gaze, a quiet resolve that told him she had been through worse than this before. Much worse. He sat on the edge of the cot, his body still sore from the torture, but the adrenaline had worn off. The pain was starting to catch up with him. His wrists ached from the chains, and the cuts on his skin stung with every movement. He couldn't remember how long he had been held captive, but it felt like a lifetime. The only thing keeping him going now was the knowledge that they had escaped, that they were out of the Zithar's grasp, at least for the moment. The woman moved quietly around the room, gathering supplies. She opened a small crate filled with food and pulled out a couple of ration bars, tossing one to Seth before unwrapping her own. She didn't speak for a while, and Seth didn't push her to talk. There was something about her presence that was both comforting and unsettling. She had saved his life, no doubt about it. But there was so much he didn't understand about her, who she was, where she came from, or why she had helped him. "Thank you," Seth finally said, his voice rough. The woman paused, looking at him. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, but she didn't say anything at first. She just nodded and returned to the supplies. She was focused, as always, her attention never wavering from the task at hand. Seth felt the weight of his words, but he didn't know what else to say. He had never been one for unnecessary small talk, and right now, he was too exhausted to think of anything else. "We're not safe here for long," the woman said suddenly, breaking the silence. She turned to face him, her voice low and steady. "The Zithar will come looking for us. They'll search this planet and they'll tear it apart if they have to." Seth looked up, meeting her gaze. He could see the certainty in her eyes. She wasn't just talking out of fear, she knew what the Zithar were capable of. He had learned that the hard way. "What's the plan?" Seth asked. The woman didn't hesitate. She walked over to a small table in the corner where a map of the planet was spread out. She pointed to a location marked with a small X. "There's a hidden escape pod on the other side of the planet. It's an old military outpost. I've been there before. It's the only way off this rock." Seth studied the map, trying to make sense of it. The planet was vast and barren, with jagged mountains and deep ravines. The outpost was far, but it was their best shot at getting away. "How far is it?" Seth asked, looking back at the woman. "Too far to walk," she replied, her voice cool and controlled. "But we'll make it. I know a way." Seth didn't question her. He had learned by now that she was capable of things that didn't make sense. In a strange way, it almost felt like she knew exactly what to do at every turn, like she had already lived through this moment before. She walked over to the supplies and grabbed a small device from a shelf. It was a communication device, compact and well-worn. She flipped it on, and a low, buzzing sound filled the room as the device powered up. "We'll need to make contact with a ship in orbit," she said, holding the device in her hand. "There's a group of rebels who are waiting for us. They'll pick us up once we reach the outpost." Seth's brow furrowed. Rebels. He hadn't expected that. He didn't know who they were or how they fit into this puzzle, but he was willing to trust her. She had already proven that she could handle herself in situations where most would have crumbled. If she said the rebels would help them, then that was good enough for him. "The Zithar won't just let us go," Seth said, more to himself than to her. "They'll be hunting us every step of the way." The woman didn't answer immediately. She sat down at the small table, examining the communication device as it beeped in quiet intervals. Seth watched her for a moment, wondering what was going through her mind. She had to be thinking about how to survive this, how to get them both out of the Zithar's grasp. "We'll keep moving just like we did before," she finally said. "We won't stop. As long as we stay one step ahead of them, they won't catch us." Seth nodded. It sounded simple, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. The Zithar were ruthless. They had nearly broken him, and he knew they wouldn't hesitate to destroy everything in their path to find them. He had to trust her, though. She had already done the impossible once. Maybe she could do it again. "We'll need to leave soon," she said, her voice firm. "The longer we stay here, the more likely they are to find us. Gather your things. We leave in 10 minutes. Seth didn't argue. He stood up, his legs unsteady at first, but the pain was manageable now. He grabbed what little gear he had and tucked it into his pack. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. He glanced around the safe house one last time, taking in the quiet, the faint hum of the communication device, and the flickering light of the far-off stars. The woman had already moved to the door, checking the area outside. She was always aware, always focused. Seth couldn't help but admire that. She had an intensity to her, a kind of presence that made everything around her seem insignificant in comparison. He still didn't know who she was, but he was starting to wonder if it even mattered. She was all that mattered right now. "Ready?" she asked, looking over her shoulder at him. Seth nodded. He was as ready as he could be. The weight of the chains still tugged at him, but he pushed through it. There was no time for weakness. The Zithar were coming, and they had to move. Together, they left the safe house, stepping back into the cold, desolate landscape. The stars above seemed distant, cold, but there was something about this moment that felt different. Maybe it was because, for the first time, Seth wasn't alone. The woman had shown him that humans could survive against all odds, and with her, maybe they could win. They moved quickly, retracing their steps through the rocky terrain, heading toward the hidden escape pod. Seth's mind raced as he thought about the journey ahead. The planet was vast and the Zithar were ruthless. But as long as they kept moving, as long as they stayed ahead of the enemy, they stood a chance. The woman didn't speak as they walked. She was scanning the surroundings, her eyes darting from one shadow to the next. Seth had learned to trust her instincts by now. She was always alert, always ready for whatever came next. After what felt like hours of walking, they finally reached a ridge that overlooked a large ravine. On the other side, Seth could just make out the faint outline of the old military outpost, its silhouette standing stark against the dimming sky. "There it is," the woman said, pointing toward the outpost. Seth took a deep breath. They were close, so close, but the journey wasn't over yet. They still had a long way to go, and the Zithar wouldn't give up. But with the woman by his side, Seth believed they could make it. "Let's finish this," he said, his voice steady now. And together they began their final trek toward the outpost and toward freedom.